So here's Phenomenology, Part 4, Guts and Garters, where I take each of those little points I've mentioned so far and drill down in detail for some of them. Let's take a look at that largest level of the social people doing a social thing and, living in a particular part of the world and having communicated in a particular way, having their whole spectrum of economic and political and age based, gender and relationships and everything else you can imagine dangerously and chaotically all stuffed into one place because they're human beings interacting with each other. I know it might be a little bit frustrating because we'd rather talk about our dice and we'd rather talk about whether we subtract this many points because of this thing happening. And I will be getting to this, but bear with me just for a little bit longer about these troublesome entities called people in relationship to this hobby of role playing. Much of what I'm saying is embedded in history and is more a matter of reflection at an individual level and further discussions than it is for this summary. Briefly, the concepts that such reflection might address include geekdom. What is it? What has it been at different times? What does it mean now? What did it mean when a great deal of the contingent details of this activity begin? We can talk about the geek social fallacies and the geek hierarchy and other things that have been on the internet for a while. They may seem a little dated in their details today, but I think the principles they address are still very much with us. And we can talk about the concept of the larger media society and entertainment and the commerce of entertainment and whether we are invested in this activity becoming a larger piece of that and specifically attaining a larger piece of the available pie of commerce, whether that's important, whether it's important to talk about who does this, how they learn about it, whether it's learned through advertising, whether it's learned through being part of the spectrum of normalness that people encounter, whether it is an underground activity, whether it is connected to other things like comics, pop culture of all kinds, and which ones. All of those things are a matter of great discussion, particularly the concept of fantasy. However, as I say, all of that is its own topic. We can move on then to just talking about the few people in question doing the activity in the moment, and we can talk about all of the interactions between their real priorities and their real sense of appropriateness and their real sense of what's exciting relative to the content at work. And the question of whether there are things that, as it turns out, people in or the group as a whole just don't want to be dealing with, or not this time, or topics whether it's okay for them or exciting or even very appropriate for them to say are in the fiction as we're doing it, but the degree to which it is explicitly described is another variable. We can talk about, aesthetically speaking, whether this group is there for a matter of being on the edge at the emotional or perhaps moral level, or whether they're there specifically not to be in any such circumstance. These are a big deal in terms of pop culture and fantasy, and they're a big deal in terms of this activity, which is creating fiction at an exceptionally ungovernable level. When I say ungovernable, what I mean is by imposing a standard that's supposed to apply to all of it. Instead, it can be constructed and take on very powerful and differing shapes in terms of people paying attention to it while they do it. So much for this larger social and interpersonal level of play. But when I say so much for it, I don't mean we abandon it. I mean, we remember that every single other thing I'm going to say is going to be happening in light of every single decision and practice at this level. Well, then, at last, though, thank goodness, let's talk about what's being imagined. And we can drill down into that too. I mentioned some things about situations and characters and how anything can be a character as long as it fulfills certain requirements to us. Fine. Let's get a little more specific in terms of what different games titles, one might properly say, what different titles, what different sets of procedures even may be doing with the imagined material. Let's talk about it particularly at the beginning of the process. What things are known? Is it a given that we have a fictional basis for the setting, the backdrop, one properly would say, for the situations we'll be dealing with? And what is known about it? And for example, if I have an instrument of play, let's call it a character. If I have an instrument of play, do I know what part of that backdrop that this character is supposed to be from, or representing, or standing against, or anything of that kind? Or is that completely open? Just open. How about how strong my character is? Is that something that is marked down? And if so, how did it get there? If not, how does my character being strong or not play into what happens during play? Let's break it down. We have things that are simply the case for everybody who's engaged in this activity this time. We are playing in this particular setting. That's just a given. Or we could be saying, you know what? That's not a given. When I say not a given, I mean the procedures associated with this title, or what we call this game, or what we say we're playing this time. Some such things have no such thing as a fixed setting. Some of them may surprise you that they don't have any such fixed setting, even though they're thought to be very, very specific in terms of their idiom. Well, anyway, all kinds of things fall into these categories of what could be fixed from the start, what could be fixed but still must be chosen from a list. An excellent example in the long history of role playing so far is choosing what sort of species that your character may be. There is a list and you pick one. There is, on the other hand, things that are not wide open. They are also a list of things that must be filled in, but you have some contingent process by which you arrive at them. You have some way in which you consult dice or any other instrument by which you say, oh, well, okay, I guess I have this much, or I guess that I am this kind, or I guess I get this thing because I entered into this contingent process. So fixed for everyone, pick from a list, subject to a contingent process, but still essentially a list. And then we have interesting things that have to be known about each of these instruments that we're using, characters or otherwise, but there's no list. Fill them in. And then finally we have the things that are not even listed, not even designated that they have to be done, but are still, for this group, this game, this way we're playing, open to input. You can actually make a pretty cool matrix. You can put all these things across the top, and then you can put different games or instances of playing games down the side and see which ones are fixed and which ones fall into which one of these different columns. You might be surprised at how many things that look like they're the same game actually have very different profiles on that chart, and how many things that you might say are very, very different in all kinds of ways, particularly idiom, actually end up being almost exactly the same. So that is a pretty important matrix or set of variables into which this play activity falls, because it sets up different avenues of input and different avenues of constraint and opportunity as a starting point. So given that, we can investigate the issue of techniques, what is done in those larger categories I talked about. I talked about scenes in a kind of a very soft sense, and I talked about the organization of more complicated and interrelating and interfering actions. And one of the things that we should concern ourselves with is mechanics. So, a technique or a set of things that must be done, things that are given that we have to get done during play in order for this to actually happen. And then we say, well, what are these mechanics, these instrumentations, and these procedures that I carry out in the moment that can turn out this way or that way? And remember that mechanics can pertain to the way we talk to each other, as well as the way that we pick up a die and roll it and look at a number, or any number of other ways of doing things. So, with all that in hand, we say, what about these mechanics? I want to break them into a couple of things. One is that some of them are always invoked. You would say, well, if this is happening in the fiction, then we pick up this stuff and we move these pieces of paper around, or we talk to each other in a particular way. Okay, I'm the this and you're the that. Whatever it is, whatever kinds of procedures are involved, what is often thought of as the rules. One way to look at it is that subject to the fiction of the moment, what somebody has just said, that's when they're invoked and we pick them up. Simultaneously, and I do not think of this as an opposed technique, I see it as a simultaneous technique, or perhaps they do a little dance with one another alternatively, is the opposite, where having invoked and utilized a particular technique that we are all recognizing, or mechanic that we're all recognizing as part of what we do here, then it plays its role in affecting the outcome of what's going on in the moment. Remember, I said that speaking about that outcome was an important part of credibility that gets kind of disproportionately allocated around the table. This is one of the most important details. Whoever is talking like this about how these actions have come out this time, what are they consulting? What set of procedures have they just engaged in, or has everybody just engaged in, by which now they can say that? Let's look at that very carefully, because if there is a commitment to the integrity of those consulted devices, that's very different from if there's not. And that person is empowered more by saying, well, I'm here to make this entertaining, and a very transitive in the sense of the creators that I talked about in the beginning in part one, the creator that is responsible for putting it together, and then later, then other people in an audience capacity get to experience it as they have constructed it. If that's going on, then consulting these devices and the way that we all made decisions and had input into this thing is minimized or absent, and is basically, there's a big wall there between what we actually do and how it turns out. Well, those are two pretty important different ways to consider how we work with the rules. Let's look at those terms, rules, again. Another one of those difficult terms like game or story. Here, I'm going to be real blunt. I'm going to say that rules are what we do and abide by. So it's not that there are rules and now we say, oh, well, I guess we have to go and abide by these. No, I'm talking about when we watch people do this and you see what they do abide by, what they do actually use, what they do consult, how they trade off these different dynamics I'm talking about. Those are their rules. They're using them. They're playing by them. Now, what does that have to do with something that we might call the rules, which is referring typically to a text? They're just two different things. They just are. Play, the way we do it, our rules, what I would think of as the really rules, those may be informed by those textual rules or those texts, or they may not. There's often a very queasy relationship between the two. Can you consult one of those textual things in terms of working out how to do the procedure. Well, if you do, then that in and of itself is a rule that that is part of what we do. And that's all it is. In another instance, that may not be the case at all. So, keeping an eye on the difficulty of that term is kind of important, particularly at the level of play that I think of as the learning curve. When people are playing by a set of ways to do it that they are still learning how to do, and there is or isn't a particular commitment to a text as part of that process. It leads us to the interesting point of saying, what is a game text, like a role-playing text? Is it a pedagogy for how to get through the learning curve so that you do this? Or is it a piece of play that is intended to be consulted and utilized as a part of what we're doing here? Those are two really different things. They may not be incompatible, but the experiences of doing one or the other are pretty hard to do simultaneously. Well, with all that in mind, again, let's get to these features of the systemic processes, the features of the mechanics. I've mentioned several times the concept of a character. A character is certainly a fictional entity. The next question is, what is that in terms of people at the table? And it's a subset of input. It's a very convenient and understandable way by which a person sitting with other people can say, okay, now where are my credibilities and my responsibilities limited or delimited, I might say. And so you would put that at the character in many cases. We find in practice it's a lot squishier than that in relationship to things that happen to the character, outcomes of how the character changes, and also in terms of what the character is experiencing or even motivated by. All of those have some very interesting inroads from other people. Furthermore, a person who may perceive themselves as playing my character may well be having a big impact on input about other things that aren't the character. You can see that actually happening when people play. Someone says, and then it cracks in half or something, and it's not their character at all. And everybody keeps going on as if that person totally had credibility in that moment for saying that thing happened. And you know what they did? Ask them later, and they say, oh no, I just play my character. Okay? So there's a squishiness there, but still, the character as a fictional entity is such a strong concept as fiction that it's worth thinking about. A lot of the mechanics of play concern what does or doesn't happen to characters and what characters can or cannot do or how well in many cases. So perhaps it's useful to think about what is character in role playing. Another list. They never end. Certainly we can talk about character as actually what we are doing as the people. If I am saying I will play a character who, as a kind of social leader in the fiction, well, that has a lot to do sometimes with me being more of the social leader at the table in terms of what our characters are going to do. That's not, I think, a bad thing. But it is worth thinking of human social roles and how characters are expressions of them. They aren't only in the fiction. We can see the way that characters are played being an important way of how we're interacting together. So, drilling down more into the fiction, we can talk about character as the characters relative to one another. This character is the sneaky one. This character is the trustworthy one. This character is the noble one. These are a lot of interesting things that we learn from the stories that we know very well and have seen repeated over and over. Sometimes we flip them. Sometimes we make them more surprising or find ways for these different roles for the characters socially among one another and thematically among one another. We find ways for them to be more interesting than just a laundry list. But the components of doing that, I think, are fairly well known. Then we have the raw fictional identity of the character in strictly fictional terms. He's or she's from this nation. The character is uh, has a profession or a background or a skill set or is basically semiotically tagged, has particular sense of their role in the world based on the raw fictional identity. And then finally, we have the notion of the character as a vector of activity. This is a really interesting thing, looking at this fictional background and looking at the character relative to the others socially, and then taking a look at where we sit as people with these characters associated with us and what that means to us as people. Then we can take a look and say, but remember, characters are not fixed entities. They are going to undergo consequences and changes in many cases. Or the things around them that they impact will undergo consequences and changes. So, what is this character in terms of a vector, in terms of what could happen, especially given that a lot of that's going to be contingent and a lot of that is going to be heavily, heavily affected by the direct imagined circumstances? Well, with all that said, we can think now about the components of these entities. How much is their activity limited by what in the fiction is thought of as resources? It could be wealth, it could be energy, it could be health, any number of things. Capital, terrible word, of all kinds. And so we have banks in many cases built into our input into play. Remember, playing a character is a subset and not a very well defined subset of input into play. But again, some banks sometimes are involved. Sometimes they're very explicit and finely divided, and other times they're kind of basic. Let's take a look then too at the impact that the character can have on other things. In many role playing titles, historically, this is expressed in terms of percentages. In others, it's expressed in terms of other quantities, this many points of impact on something or somebody. All sorts of interesting different ways to quantify it, and yet there are also the qualitative forms too. When it comes to physical conflict and inflicting damage, the quantitative aspect has a very rich history in the hobby. When it comes to impacting other characters socially and affecting their behavior, you see a much more uneasy and experimental approach throughout the entire hobby of just what it means to say, well, this character is telling that character that's really not the right thing to do. Well, to what extent is that going to affect the other character's behavior? And is that the same thing as putting your axe through that character's head? They are both means of affecting that character drastically. Well, these two sets are not the same in terms of how they've been addressed historically. So, with all these in mind, you've got your characters and you've got their effectiveness on other things in different ways and with different histories of how that's done. You have these banks that I was talking about, which may be so abstract as to not be perceived as a bank, but they're there, or they may be extremely explicit. And then you also have something to do very much with all those four levels of character I talked about before, where they currently stand relative to the other characters. Where do they stand in terms of what? Lots of things. Where do they stand in terms of fictional presence? Where do they stand in terms of prior events? Where do they stand in terms of relationships? Where do they stand in terms of goals? How flexible are those goals? All of those standings, I suppose you might say, all of those factor into both the resources that I talked about, the banks, and also the effectiveness that I talked about, the degree of and the chance for success for impacts that they may have. Thinking of those as the components of character and recognizing not only that different ways to play set up different ways to establish them, as I talked about before, different ways to play emphasize them and interconnect them differently. There are many ways to play in which a change in one is it occurs due to diminishing another. So, for example, if your character is badly hurt and you need to heal that character, you have to lose this other set of resources in order to do it. That's a simple example, and there are lots and lots of them. There is an interplay among those three things, the effectiveness and the resources and the positioning or standing of the characters. There are interplays among them that may be heavily quantified. And if they're not heavily quantified, are treated in a somewhat more amorphous but yet just as exchangey way. How that's apportioned, acknowledged, what particular mechanics or instruments are used. Sometimes an instrument is used that treats those things as the same, for example. Sometimes the instruments really divide them into different ways, and transferring from one to the other is a much more formalized process. That's a bit about characters. How about events? I spoke about those different credibilities and responsibilities and the way they may be distributed in a particular instance of play. I also talked about the importance of what the characters are up to, trying to do, accomplishing, and the impact of it all at once. Now, really, has a lot to do with how spontaneous play can be. In the context of playing in this moment, in this time, with these characters, this one's doing this one thing, this one's doing this other thing. What is the scope for introducing new activity? What is the scope for jump-starting a particular set of procedures with big consequences? What is the procedure for basically changing up what's going on? Once we understand that a given way to play has a very fixed notion of where that kind of spontaneous input can be introduced and who gets to do it, and it also brings us into the picture of uh, the instrumentation. So some of the instrumentation has evolved through the history of the hobby in such a way that it's very, very well known to everybody at that particular play group, and everybody's really invested in this is how we do it in a mechanical sense, even at the cost of that spontaneity in the fiction, and even at the cost of the fiction itself being compelling. A really good example is something of a desperation move to organize input during the complexity of a very complicated situation, typically, say, a combat with multiple characters doing multiple things, and what ultimately has become an extremely linear way of doing it from person to person to person, which can be very functional and I think has been often accepted as okay, this is the only way. Don't know any other way we could do this. We can't all be shouting at once. It's got to get apportioned in some way. At least we're apportioning it by the characters' relative speeds or according to a dice roll that we just made and abide by, whatever it is. But now the effect on the fiction is very much a matter of freeze framing. Everyone else is frozen while this one goes. And there are ways to organize it in a fashion such that the fiction is not as, shall we say, stalled, cut up, and made into a form which really isn't very compelling as fiction. But it's a good example of how do we handle the organization in a way that really is understandable and cuts down on what I was talking about as the murk, and yet how do we do it such that the fiction blossoms rather than simply becomes a bit of a follow up or a distorted thing that kind of limps along because we had to do it this way. So, do we just say, well, the rules will take care of us? Well, no, the rules as text are the biblos, the flotsam and jetsam of people grappling with this at tables. And as I have mentioned or implied, their pedagogy is sometimes less powerful than their content, and their content itself is difficult. It's pretty easy to see when these dynamics break down. Play begins to be filled with phrases like not yet and no it doesn't or you wouldn't do that and any number of things that all reflects, we don't need to even parse them, they all reflect a breakdown of the integrity of play and a breakdown of engagement, and even worse, a power struggle. Another, I think, quite cool aspect of these ways, these components of characters, is to think of them as subject to all of the consequences that I talked about. Remember the negative consequences, and remember the advancement or positive or generally more vivid development of play, and in this case, of a character. We have these things to work with and the way that they can be connected to one another, often quantitatively. And so you end up with these really interesting uh, potential trajectories for how change may occur, sometimes wide open, sometimes fixed, sometimes blended for different components.